hints from there about what that might tell us about the dynamic towards imperialism within the capitalist mode of production. So what I positioned last time was these first three parts of volume 3. The rate of surplus value is established as one of the main determinants of the rate of profit, along with the organic composition of capital and the rate of turnover. Basically, the rate of profit will increase as the rate of surplus value increases, and it will decrease as the organic composition of capital increases. Now, what Marx does once he's established the parameters of the problem in part 2 is he only really looks at one main variable, which is the different sectors of production according to their average organic composition of capital. And he basically suspends or keeps as fixed the rate of surplus value. And he does involve the turnover to some degree as well in part 2. And what I've going to show a bit more today is how he treats in part 3, where he's looking at declining rate of profit, the differential rates of surplus value. And the dotted line is almost perfect because it sort of like keeps skipping in and out, basically, as we'll see in a bit more detail as I go through it. So really the main driver for part 3 from Marx's exposition is the increasing organic composition of capital will lead to a decline in the rate of profit. And the other methodological point I make, and this will keep returning to this, is it's without doubt, it's very explicit actually in part 2 that Marx's unit of analysis is capitalism in one country. And these are the points that I ended the lecture last time on. What about different rates of surplus value? We need to include them in a fuller solution to the problem that Marx himself posed. We need to follow the reasoning to include the interaction between higher organic composition of capital and increasing rates of surplus value. And I'm basically arguing, okay, I now need to start putting my money where my mouth is. There's another point that I made here, is that the transition from commodities simple value to price of production is not just one modification, but a whole series of modifications, some of which I would say are, if you like, in the realm of realization, and some of them are in the realm of distribution of profits. And I'll explain that in a minute. I'll come back to that as we go through. In order to understand this, there's a big shift in focus away from commodity markets to capital markets, the way capital relates to itself, in a sense, how the total social capital moves in and out of individual capitals at the level of movement of money from one sector or one capital to another. And then last time the conclusion was that we do have to rethink in fairly rigorous way the way Marx posed the problem, but to take much more explicitly into account the question of the international relations of capitalism, and in particular capital's access to land and oppressed labor. And that's exactly what I want to start doing with today's session. Very helpful feedback. I would really like to acknowledge the comrades, and we'll come back to that next time. The points that were raised were extremely helpful and productive. I can't cover them all in full now. Yeah, entirely because of time and not for their significance. Very quickly, Marx assumes an equalization of the rate of profit, but I think it's fair to say he posits that as an idealized tendency. And of course, it may not be the case. There are counteracting tendencies which may prevent rates of profit from, in fact, equalizing. Another very good point is what happens when, say, the same sort of technical composition, the factory that moves from the United States to Mexico or from Britain to South Africa, what happens then in terms of value composition? if organic composition is a reflection of technical composition, but the actual conditions of relation between capital and labor are different in one region to another, then doesn't that complicate the picture? And the answer is exactly right. It does complicate the picture. What about cotton as an example? Huge question to answer. And I would like to come back to that in a completely different context. But I think that the thread that cotton gives to the capitalist mode of production is only partially recognized by Marx in volume 1. Cotton comes in on chapter 7, which is when he starts explicitly dealing with the capitalist mode of production. And it comes in as a given rather than as something in itself to be analyzed using Marx's value relations. Marx is full of insights about cotton and slavery, that this enslaved African American labor that produced it, all over his writings, but not a specific analysis. This next question is extremely important, and we will touch on it today. And it's something that is also a thread, if you like, a theoretical thread, which we will follow going from here on in, basically. Is there a difference between realization? I emphasized last time that the transformation has to be understood as a differential realization of surplus value into profit. And I do distinguish that from the distribution of surplus value. Now, what does that mean for questions of value transfer? It's a very big question, but it's a very sort of central one theoretically and practically. So I welcome the point. Another very good point which was raised is that skilled labor, or Marx also used the term complex labor, needs to be taken into account. Indeed, it does. I mean, Marx kind of like puts it to one side very early on in volume 1 and never really comes back to it. There's so many points one could make about this. I mean, increasing organic composition of capital does not, by definition, either increase or decrease the skill of labor, because you can see certainly de-skilling takes place with increased machine production, but then of course you also have increased engineers and so on. So I think that the general tendency of a rising organic composition of capital, one might say, is a separation from mental to manual labor. And of course, this is built on in terms of regional differences. And again, it's a huge question of social construction. So yeah, it's a major factor, which in the concrete analysis we have to bring in. And then in terms of concrete analysis, we had a lovely recount of a situation in India with production in a multinational corporation being effectively outsourced within India. And I mean, that is exactly the type of concrete detail which my rather general and, if you like, schematic presentation, certainly needs testing against such realities and indeed filling out. So that was a very nice contribution. Okay, moving on to the new content. Part 3 of volume 3 has got 3 chapters, and I will briefly go through them. I'm actually most interested in chapter 14, but I will touch on the other 2. Chapter 14 is the counteracting factors. So in chapter 13, Marx opens with this example. So he's keeping his rate of surplus value S over V at 100%, as he customarily does. Now, what he wants to show here is he's keeping the rate of surplus value the same, and he's keeping the variable capital the same, which means you've got the same number of workers being exploited to the same extent. So if you see the column variable capital of 100, then there's also an implied column of surplus value of 100 for each of these different cases. But what varies is the amount of constant capital, i.e. the amount of investment in machinery and technology and raw materials that varies in each case. Now, in the way Marx presents the transformation, he sort of uses this type of variation to look at different sectors, more or less capital intensive sectors. But one could also do this in terms of a progression over time of a given totality, a given total social capital, which is the use to which Marx now puts this idea of an increasing constant capital. So you can see for each row representing a different point in time, the number of workers does not increase, their degree of exploitation does not increase, but what does increase is the amount of constant capital that they're working with. So the third column, the total capital involved, increases 100 at a time after the first one. Now then, if the same number of workers to the same degree of exploitation in terms of surplus value is a holding, then you're going to have the same surplus value in each of these cases, but the rate of profit is going to vary because the amount of total capital invested, C plus V, is increasing while the amount of surplus value is holding as the same. So what we have then is this ratio of S over C plus V. At this point, Marx doesn't make the distinction, by the way, between the total capital applied and the capital used up. So he sort of like skirts over that issue in his presentation. So putting that to one side for the time being, what we have then is as the constant capital increases, so the total amount invested increases. Now, what this shows is an accumulation of capital from one period to another. But look what happens under these terms, the degree of rate of profit decreases. And this is simply because the workers are using more and more